Welcome to the Here We Go podcast, a place to share your experiences in football programs that players have loved regardless of record or on-the-field accolades. I'm Tom Letson with my co-host, Greg LaCava. All right, episode 3, Coach LaCava. How you doing today, man?
Hey, Coach Letts, I'm excited for today, man. I've been thinking about this for at least a week, trying to gather all my memories.
That's awesome.
And
Yeah.
because we are actually going to flip the script, and I'm actually going to interview today. People out in social media world, bear with me. I'm not a great interviewer. I like to be asked questions and answer, but I'm going to flip the script.
We're just
And
talking. It's a
we're
Seinfeld.
just talking. It's
We're
like
just
we're
talking.
talking, sitting in our living room,
That's it.
watching a college football game. You're gonna, this is a very special for me to be able to do this, and I think that I need to make sure that everyone understands our relationship goes way beyond the football field.
Oh, yeah.
But I would never have been able to done any of this without you, and I always, before I was the head coach of three places, right? Yeah,
Yeah, 3 places.
three places. And before I ever interviewed for these jobs, the first person I called was you to ask if you would come and be my defensive coordinator.
Yep.
And for all those players that had the opportunity to coach for Coach Letson on the defensive side of the ball, and also, as you know, you owe it to him for saying yes, or else I would never follow through with any of those head coaching jobs, because you were my trusted, and I always, I've always felt, I always felt stronger with you by my side. I mean, and that's a credit to you. And you put my mind at ease with a lot of stuff, and I love the differences in personalities and the differences in how we coached, but it just worked.
Yeah.
So like today, like I have all my notes written down, and I have my phone with notes on my phone, and I can remember many a defensive practices when I'd be like, you have a practice schedule, and you're like, yeah, I'm making it up as we go. And I
Well,
think that was probably one of the hardest things I had to deal with, because coming from my brain, I'm like, I was always scripted and you were loosely scripted.
loosely scripted.
But once I accepted that, it was like smooth sailing, man. Smooth
Yeah.
sailing.
Well,
So
we can get into the differences there because offense encompasses so much, and you have to touch into these different periods. But with defense, a lot of times it's a feel.
right.
So I might have to spend most of the practice time on a certain very important aspect of a game plan or a scheme, and that's just how it is. And I'll play catch up later.
Right.
You know.
So we're going to get into the mind of this incredibly creative, incredibly intense, and incredibly knowledge defensive coordinator who, like I said, I would never have been a head coach without him. So we're going to flip the switch.
Thanks. Before you go forward, just let me comment a little bit about what you said. So, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. And people who know us that, we are great friends and have been
Mhm.
for a long time. And, outside of football. So it's just not a football thing.
Right.
But you and taking these jobs, okay, I don't know if every head football coach is like this. I don't know what the percentage is, and I think it's less today. You knew how important it was, okay, to have a defensive coordinator, not just a name,
Right.
okay, but someone that was into defense and focused on defense, and loved it. You know what I mean? And that brought you a certain comfort
Mhm.
because you knew the guy next to you, loved what he was doing.
Right.
So it wasn't just, yeah, I love coaching kids and I love football, but I love coaching defensive football, and that's all I've done. And
Right.
we can get into a little bit of that as to why. And I'm
Mhm.
still juiced up, about it. You know what I mean? And I take it personal. I take every freaking yard personal. Everyone, every
Right.
single one. You know?
Well, obviously, just by, people that are watching this, listening to you, can tell when that flip switches in you, and how intense you talk about defense. And so I brought my nicotine
Good.
pouches to keep me soothed throughout this podcast, and we're gonna jump right into it. All
Here we
right.
go.
So, obviously, I know your history. I know you played defensive back at Shore Regional back in its heyday when you guys were extremely successful. I've you've discussed Coach Camerano was his
Coach
name?
Camerano. Yep.
And
One of my mentor.
your respect for him, not only as a coach, but as a role model on the high school level. So I want to touch a little bit on your playing days at Shore and what defense you guys ran there, what you may have taken, even though you were young. I know you thought differently than most of the players, young players. You were very technical and always thinking on the football field. So my first question is, what defense did you run at Shore Regional?
Yeah. Okay. So before I get to Shore Regional, I want to go a little bit before I got into Shore, okay? Because, I didn't know too much about football at all. I mentioned this on a previous podcast, and I want to give props to some childhood friends of mine. My dad, was an athletic guy, but he wasn't into sports. And, so I didn't know sports at all. Actually, the funny thing is, if baseball was me and my brother's thing. And
Mhm.
the reason is we got into baseball because my grandmother was a Mets fan. My dad's mom was a Mets fan, rabid Mets fan. And so we got into baseball and we loved it. And we were baseball players and we were good at that. And I was confident at that. But football, I mean, I didn't know too much about football, but following sports, I got to like it. And then playing pick up, tackle football behind our school. And, I was a quiet kid and I was fast. That was my thing. I wasn't tough or anything like that, I wasn't one of the leaders and, but I wanted to play. I was competitive, and I'm going to give hats off to some guys. You'll know some names here, I grew up with Bill George and Dan George, his little brother, and a couple other names, Mark Rassiopi.
Mhm.
This is all from Oceanport, New Jersey. Nick Halper. These guys were competitive guys, knowledgeable in football, and they were leaders. You know what I mean? And I just followed their lead. Like
Mhm.
to be included with them and to compete with them, and they recognized my speed. Like I was always on the Georges team because the Georges had they had four brothers, but Tommy was a little bit too young to play at that time. So it was
Right.
usually Billy, Danny, and Alex. And so they were always a team, the three of them, the brothers. And they always picked me for the most part because I had speed and I offset the speed of the other guy on the other team, Nicky, a little bit. He was faster than me. And then when I got into high school, the guys that I played with, again, competitive guys, they were leaders. And I was, I found out how important role players were on a football team.
Right.
One of my best friends, Danny McLaughlin, and Mike King, and again, Mark Rassiopi from my childhood played at Shore Regional as well. And these guys were competitive and football players, and I followed their lead. So and I was an important part of our team. So I went from knowing nothing. I wasn't even a starter on my freshman football team, because I didn't know football that much, and I wanted to be an offensive player. I was fast. I could catch the ball, and so I wanted to be a receiver, a running back, and I had dreams of that. So I went from, I started maybe a couple of games as a defensive back, something I didn't want to do as a freshman, and then. I started playing defense on JV. I love JV, and then I
Mhm.
learned how to. I love started loving playing defense, defensive back.
Mhm.
And so, when it became apparent that offensively it wasn't going to work out for me because we had an all-star running back, Timmy Britton, that got a scholarship to Rutgers, and he was an amazing talent. I switched to the defensive side of the ball, and then I was all in. And I was a starter as a junior, so I
Mhm.
knew nothing about football coming to high school, and I ended up being a starter as a junior. And but when I was a senior, that's when I really started to be coming to my own and be confident in my play.
Mhm.
So in high school, to answer your question, and I didn't know this at the time because I wasn't a coach. Well, we were, Coach Camerano was something else. He wasn't the defensive coach, but he set the tone, okay, with his intensity. Okay, he was an intense man that didn't scream. Okay, and when he needed to be loud, he was loud. Okay, and if people, they might look at me and say, or see me yelling at a game and say, hey, this guy's a lunatic. I'm not a lunatic. I don't scream at players. Am I loud? Yes, I am. Am I intense? Yes. I think my intensity comes out of my pores in many times. But Coach Cameron, I loved him, and had him for 4 years. That's it. I loved the man to this
Mhm.
day.
Mhm.
And he was only head football coach there for the 4 years that I was there. He was 31-9 was his career record. He didn't stop coaching. He stopped being the head coach. At his 35 years old or 36, he left and went back to school, to get a master's degree, and ultimately was the assistant superintendent who does the math, the accounting, uh,
Business administrator.
business administrator for the district. Ultimately, in his future, but we played a 4-4, a straight 4-4. We played fast teams. We never stunted. We sat in a 4-4. Like when I looked at old film, I couldn't believe it. But that taught me something, that if you were disciplined, okay, and coached great in the fundamentals, and you
Mhm.
were a good football team. We were very experienced as a senior. We had 7 guys coming back or something like that, as starters. And if we played our positions well, it didn't matter. Okay. At that time, offenses could not put you in a position to take advantage if you were just playing a straight defense, and
Mhm.
didn't get out of it. But something else about Coach Camerano, he was so intense, and he was very philosophical man. And he used to say something that I would run through a wall for this man. Okay. And all my teammates would, for the most part. But I remember a radio interview he did, and after in my senior year, we weren't expected to upset, even though we had a very experienced team coming back. We were 4-5 when we were juniors. We had a very experienced team coming back. We ended up being 11-0, but we upset, St. John Vianney and RBC in the first 2 games. And so it was a surprise to a
Mhm.
lot of people in the area. And during a radio interview, he was just so happy for us, and he goes, all we want to know, he goes, look, I'll never forget him saying, we're not a football power, like your Bricks and your Manasquans. All we want to know is that when you come here, you got to play us. He
Right.
goes, you better come here to play us. And I heard that, and I'm like, just find the closest cinder block freaking wall. I just want to run through
Well,
that.
that was a message you carried in all my years coaching with you as my defense coordinator. That was the
Yep,
same message that
yep,
you share with your players
yep.
and actually with our whole team. It wasn't just the defensive side of the ball, and I think that's you talked about quiet intensity, and that I think that's me. I think I'm not a yeller and a screamer, but kids know when
Oh yeah,
my tone in my voice dictates my mood at the time.
yeah,
And I agreed with that. And, there were times when, just as a side note, after we left Middletown South, I went up and interviewed at another school, and I actually went to a summer workout, and all I heard was screaming and yelling and cursing, and I chose not to coach there.
yeah.
And that's the message I carried throughout my coaching days and hiring hiring assistants. The first rule was you're not screaming, you're not cursing at players. We don't use all this foul language. So I think that was another one of the things that drew us together is that we
Yes.
believe those same philosophies. And I think that again, not that was just my childhood growing up that way. My parents are very strict and we couldn't there was no cursing and getting loud as a kid or any of that stuff. You never
We
got any of
we
that.
we couldn't say hell or damn.
Nothing. Couldn't say anything. But I know Coach Camafora when he came in, that became, we talked about this with Coach Bova, that became, one of the guiding principles of the program. And I carried that with me as a head coach and even as an assistant coach. My players were going to see me one way and whatever the other coaches were doing, that's not my, when I was an assistant, that's what they're doing is their business. That's not how I'm doing it.
Yep.
And it caused some stress between coaches and between players, position players and stuff, but I wasn't going to change. So yes, you've spoken often, fondly about your times at Shore Regional and with Coach Camerano, and I wish I met the man.
It was a great. We
I
we
wish
coached against him.
I
Uh,
remember him on the sideline.
when we were at Homedale, he was
Yeah,
helping his son Andy, was the Spotswood head coach at the time, and he was up top and helping
Mhm.
him out, helping him call offense from up there, and he was
Yeah,
great after the game, and he's like, and we stopped the run, and they ended up we were in man coverage, and they ended
yeah,
up throwing 2 long touchdown passes.
touchdowns. I remember. Yeah,
And Cam, he comes down and he goes, I just couldn't get to that middle backer. I go, Cam, you're not supposed to. There
right.
was no way I was going to let you get to that middle backer. I
Right.
had to protect it. Yeah, but I
Mhm.
could talk forever on Coach Cameron.
Oh, I know you can. And that could be, another part
Yeah,
of a podcast. All right, so you played defensive back. You guys won a state title, I believe, against Asbury Park your
yeah,
senior year.
yeah.
Coach Conti was coaching Asbury Park at that time.
Yeah, Coach Conti. Now, obviously I didn't know Coach Conti, but it's such an ironic thing and how
Yeah,
random life is that these two men were meeting and I was playing and they both were very influential, okay, in my coaching career. I didn't
right,
know it at the time with Coach Conti, and Coach Conti hadn't developed, into the type of creative high school coach that he was to become. I don't think so anyway, from what I knew as a high school player. But yeah. So we can jump into Coach Conti, or we can start in the middle of when we got to South. Tell me where you want
I
me to
I
start.
mean, I remember those wars against Ocean when we were at South. Anyway, we'll get to that as we move down the road. So, you graduated from Shore Regional and you went to college and
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your college experience.
Well, I mean, this is a whole nother podcast, you know what I mean? But I'll just briefly say that it was an intense experience. Now, when I came out of high school, winning, being 11-0 football team, like that was my self-esteem. Like
Hmm.
I didn't really have any other self-esteem. It was that.
Hmm.
So, initially I didn't know if I could play college football, but one of my coaches encouraged me to try. So, I went to Montclair, and a couple of my friends went there too, and I didn't make the cut. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? And you don't know when you're a kid. When you go to college and you were like a state champion, everybody was a state
I
champion.
know.
You know what I mean?
You start from zero again.
Yeah. So being inside my own head, and it crushed me. Obviously, it
Hmm.
crushed me. I was devastated. I got depressed, no question about it. And because the rug was pulled out from under me. I was not no longer a football player. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it was crushing.
Yeah.
So I it was drastic to me. So I took a drastic measure. And the drastic measure was, I had gotten a mailer from Glassboro State College, and when you're young, you don't know these things. You get it. Now we know that these state colleges send out mailers to
Everyone.
all the football players.
Right.
Well, I thought maybe they wanted me. You know what I mean? So I decided, and I loved Montclair. I loved my friends up there. I loved the campus. I loved everything about it. I
Right.
left. I left on this freaking journey, okay, to this football journey to figure this thing out. So I went down there. I hated Glassboro.
Right.
Glassboro sucked.
Which is now
Now
Rowan
Rowan.
University.
Then we had our football camps down there
I know.
at Colts Neck.
Yeah.
Stayed in those damn dorms. It's been
100
terrible,
degrees, 100 degrees in
terrible.
there.
I lived in that, but so I played JV down there, and I played the season, and I ended up alternating as a starter. I got into one varsity game, which was cool, and I didn't like my experience down there, but I got it out of my system. And as
Right.
crazy as this sounds, I probably wouldn't have admit this years ago, but now I don't mind as an older man. But I transferred back to Montclair. I miss my friends. I miss Montclair. I
Yeah.
got it out of my system. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And
Hmm.
I came to terms with it. And it
Yeah.
was time for my life to move on.
Understood.
So I really didn't think too much about football or coaching or anything
Right.
like that.
Well, you shared with us previously that Coach Janarelli, when he came in, he said he at the South in 1985. He said there was a position open. You came in 85, but no, you
No,
came
86.
86. You came my senior
Yeah.
year.
If it wasn't for
Oh,
Coach Generelli, I'll
no,
tell you.
I know, but he
Yeah.
he put that in your ear that there was a
Yeah.
position. Yeah.
Yeah, he
Um,
contacted me.
mhm.
Yeah, he found out there was an opening on the staff. He got the O line job there. He was doing his student teaching and
Right.
called me. He goes, "Hey, let's." I talked to Coach Comafero. He said, I told him all about you. He wants to meet you. And
Yeah.
yeah, and he hired me in to be the D back coach. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, and just to touch on that, when that was my senior year, and back then we had no contact because it
No.
was a two platoon system.
Yep.
And which brings me to another thing. I think that is why, as an assistant coach, where as I got older, I'm like, I'm not coaching the defensive side of the ball. I am an
Yeah.
offensive guy, and that's what I am. And that has held me back from coaching again because I don't want to coach the defensive side of the ball. I know that's so selfish, but at this stage in my life, I'm just like, whatever. I mean, this is what I do, and this is what I want to do, and if that's good enough, that's good enough.
I wanted you to coach linebackers one year, man.
Oh
Like
my
I
God.
was like,
I mean, I did coach linebackers one
you
year.
helped me out. You
I
helped me
helped
out.
you out, and my mind is not a defensive mind. Although, just going back to some glory days, when I was a sophomore at South, we actually had a sophomore schedule. So we played a sophomore schedule,
Yeah, that's right.
and
Yes.
and I played the monster in our 52, and I love defense,
Oh,
man.
yeah.
I freaking loved it. I mean, I played both ways. I started
Yes.
outside backer and tailback as a sophomore on the sophomore level. I played some JV games, but I love defense. I mean,
Yeah.
I just love being on the field. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, that was what I love. But moving forward, when Coach Camaforo came in, so Coach Mosca was my sophomore year, and that was the end. I never saw the defensive side of the ball again. I was a running back, and that's what I did. And so we never had a lot of interaction,
No.
um, going through that. So let's move a little forward. So you graduate from Montclair.
Yes.
Okay, we don't have to talk about your professional career at that point
No.
because I don't care about it. All I care is about that you got out of it and came into
Yep.
coaching.
Yep.
So when you came to South, did you as a position coach and then next as a defensive coordinator, did you take any of your Shore regional knowledge to you and try to implement that when you were a position coach, defensive back coach first, and then when you became the defense coordinator?
Well, I mean, it was a big journey going from, coming in in 1986, my first year, and not knowing anything. I knew, and again, I told you in high school we ran, cover three. That's what we ran. We
Hmm.
had a little bit of a rotation to a cover two once in a rare while. It was mainly a flow type of rotation.
Hmm.
We came in, and when I came in the South, I knew how to coach secondary for the most part, because I played it. I didn't know
Hmm.
any other defensive positions, and I didn't know
Hmm.
how defense worked. Like, this is one of the things that when I became a coach, it was important to me because I could play my position, but I didn't understand how defense worked when I was in high school. They didn't explain it. Like, what is this scheme? Why does it work this way? Whose job is what? And they probably were reluctant to because the old coaches adage is you do your job, don't do someone else's job,
Right.
because then you're going to get hurt.
But
You
that's
know,
not the same thing. I know when you look back at it, it's not the same thing. I mean,
right,
everyone has to do their job, and I think you're perfectly right with that. I don't think many players back in our day had any clue what was going on the other side of the ball. We didn't because we didn't
right,
think about it. We focused on our own side.
right. So initially, how did I get to know football? I can tell you how. Like, we ran when I came in, the A, what were we, A North? The A
Yeah.
North was everybody was running a 50 at the time,
Yep.
everyone. So
Hmm.
Vic Golat was the defensive coordinator. He was a good guy. He was unstructured though. So he was unstructured, but he was a good guy, he knew what he was doing. He had coached at the college level with Keith, I think.
Hmm.
And it was a 52, and so I learned the 52, and the main coverage out of 50. We either played cover zero or cover three, okay, which I knew, okay, or we play man, okay, and
Hmm.
so and this is where I differed, we always played man whenever they would run a blitz, they'd send the backers, they'd always play man, always.
That's a college mentality.
you know and so and again, my philosophy, there's a lot into my philosophy, in regards to how you, you know how it evolved, and that high school is a different game. And I mentioned George Conti. He helped me understand this by scouting him, and high school is a different game, and you have to approach it differently, to be more successful at it, I believe. you
Mhm.
know but so we started in the 52. And one thing that separated me, and I don't know if guys like do this today, like, there's so many distractions today and so many things that guys can do and get into. Like, I did things with my friends. We went skiing and played golf and everything, but I was going to grad school and I coached football. I was so passionate about football. Okay.
Mhm.
I wanted to learn I went to as many clinics. I would go to scouting. I was just passionate. I wanted to learn more. I read books, let me share my screen real quick, to show you. I want to show you this book that I stole. Do we see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so Complete Guide to 50 Defenses in Football by Jack Alcott. This was in the office, Keith Comafero, and sorry, Coach, but I stole this from you, and I don't have it anymore. This is all family. I took a screenshot. Well, I don't know what happened to it, but I love this book. Like, I dove into this, and this book helped me develop my 50 approach, in the years to come. and I relied on this. And
Right.
and these books don't sell much. You know what I mean? They don't sell much. So, but God bless these guys that have written it, especially for younger guys. So I just want to take that off the screen because I just want to emphasize that I dove into it. And then when I became a defensive coordinator, I took the film home with me. We had 8 millimeter
Yeah,
film and a
I know.
projector.
I know.
I sat at my kitchen table,
Yeah.
okay, with the screen on the wall, the screen about that big, so I could get so close to it, and I would just watch over and over, okay, how players were getting beaten, and then read about what appropriate technique was, and it was just like it just came together at that point. You
Right.
know what I mean? And
So
yeah,
that was your aha moment when it all clicked for you. Like you realized what's going on here.
I started to understand what wins. We were talking about this before. What wins? What's the foundation of having a solid defense and winning it defense? Like
Right.
scheme is secondary. What
Hmm.
is primary? Okay, is stance.
Hmm.
Okay, keeping your shoulders square, regardless of what Nick Saban says. We can get into that. Okay. Okay. That low squat stance. Okay, keeping your shoulders square. Okay, reading your keys, and exploding out of your stance, depending where you are. Like obviously, if you're a D back, you're going backwards, but exploding out of your stance, hit, separate, get off, and run to the football in a very, very bad mood, and that's
Right.
the intense part, you
Right.
know. So that's the base, that's the foundation. Like all your guys have to get that down in
Hmm.
regards to the basics football tech. There's technique within their position. Obviously, like I mentioned, D backs and what their technique is. Obviously, their technique's different than the defensive end technique. But generally speaking, the foundation of defensive football is staying low, okay,
Right.
staying square, okay, hitting, separating from your blocker to get off and get down and run to the football in a bad mood. That's the foundation, you
Right.
know and I believe that I think some guys skip that,
Well,
and they want to get into schemes.
this is why we touched about it when you were asking me questions about the offensive side of the ball, what you felt was the most important part of practice. Now, this we emphasize the squat position, staying low, back flat, head up, shoulders back. We and that's what we practice in the weight room,
Yep,
and that is the part of why this sport is so different than
yep.
everything else, because there are so many things off the field, the weight room, the speed, the agility, the flexibility, the plyometric stuff that you have to master to be able to put it into practice on the football field. And I think that's one of the things we did very well together. We believed in that philosophy. Like you got to be in a great stance. And that's something that we always talked about.
Oh,
And if you recall, there were times when I coached the offensive line and I would make them sit in their stance with their hand down and we would time it with their back flat. And as soon as their butt started to go down, I'm like, whoop, we got to start all over again. Right guard's butt is
yep,
starting to go down. And we emphasized you have to have the same stance from the first snap to the last snap of the game. And we
yep.
we we did that off the field by conditioning our players in the weight room and in our sand workouts,
Yep.
which I hope an ex-player comes on, and obviously Abby can come on and talk about this, but our
Oh, the
sand
sand.
workouts
Oh,
in the summer, which
God.
was one of the most creative things I ever created in my life. I'm
Right.
like, where did I come up with
And
this?
and 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 look at this. Like she'll come on and tell you, like they were miserable doing that.
Yeah,
She's does it today. She
I
does
know.
those sand workouts today and
She's
loves them.
she sent me a message about that
Yep.
several months ago that she was out doing the workout. All right, we got off on a
Well,
sidetrack.
well. Let's sidetrack just a little bit more here,
All
okay?
right,
'Cause we'll let some people in on our secret sauce, and I'm sure, guys. Look, when we say this stuff, Greg and I
we
have
didn't
been together.
create it all. We didn't
Right, right.
create
We've been
everything.
together a long time. We understand other guys do this stuff too,
Right.
and we're just going to share a little bit about what we found to be most effective. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
listen, most of the guys, this is a very, like Bova mentioned, it's violent men. This is a violent sport. I mean, and sometimes emotions get the best of you. But yeah, I mean, most of the guys that we ever went up against, yeah, they're really fine guys. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Of
Fine
course.
guys. Really like these guys, even during the heat of battle, sometimes if came across the wrong way. But I have such respect for the guys, unless someone was like just a just a real jerk. You know what I mean? Like, and there were
Our
some.
our jerk meter is very high, and we
Yeah,
don't have
there
a
were
we,
there
we
were
don't have a
some.
lot of grace.
But generally speaking, man, the guys are great. Anyway, the reason what I'm saying is, if we were to pick one drill, and I know you're going to be on the same page with me,
Mhm.
what drill teaches kids the importance of stance and how to play in a phone booth, okay, and survive what football's like? What drill? Okay, and that drill we learned from South, and that's 3-on-3 drills in a
Yeah.
shoot.
Yeah.
Okay, and it is a devastating drill. Kids can get hurt. Okay, like live team is a joke. Okay, live team, is so spread out. Here you're reducing it. Okay, to 4-on-4. Okay, three offensive linemen, one back, three defensive linemen, one linebacker,
Yeah.
and it's in a shoot. There's nowhere to hide, and
Nowhere.
it is the nastiest freaking drill. You can't do it often, okay, because kids get hurt. And you will find as a football coach, the kids who want to do it come to the front,
Yeah.
and the kids that are a little bit more shy about it, they will go to the back.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. I
and
remember those.
oh man, you talk about
We carried those on, and then I remember as an offensive coach, especially when our numbers weren't great. I remember we were I would stand there while we're doing that period. I'm like, we can't continue to do this. Someone is going to get freaking hurt here.
yeah,
And I know we started to shy away from it. And it also, the times were different as we got older in our career. You couldn't do that stuff.
right,
You're putting kids in terrible positions. But then it's one of those things, you think back, well, we used to do it. What's the difference now? Like that's
yeah.
the mentality. I always, as we get older, we always have, well, we used to do this, we used to do that,
I
and they
mean,
don't do it anymore.
the thing is though, but that being such a controlled
Yeah,
environment, we
that
were
was wild.
quick with whistles. Do you know
Mhm.
what I mean? And also we also use this as a remedy to a flat practice.
Yes,
Like if guys were going flat, we're like, all right, three on
line
three,
up.
let's go. You
Yeah,
know,
I remember.
that was probably the ultra okay football practice drill that we did that taught. I mean, like that taught
Toughness, man. Oh my
how
God.
to play the freaking game.
And
That's
that and that you cannot hide on the football field. I mean, you can't hide, man. There are one-on-one battles going
and that
crazy.
this game isn't for everyone.
That's true. Very
You know,
true. All right, so now you become in 1986, you become the defensive
back
coordinator.
no
Oh, I'm sorry.
86. Yep.
Yes, you were position that was your first year. So the following year you became quote unquote the defense coordinator, correct? You want to tell us that story
Yeah.
real
So
quick?
so 86 and 87, Coach Camaforo was the coach, and Vic Golat continued to be the defensive coordinator. So I was the defensive back coach. Okay.
Mhm.
I became the defensive coordinator during the '88 season. Okay, I designed all the game plans, and I was kind of co-coordinator.
Mhm.
Okay, with Coach Bob Denman.
Mhm.
And I think we were both learning at the same time, and he was a good man, and I appreciate him for allowing me to have input and then to take the lead at certain times, particularly since the game plans were my schemes, and but I want to, before I get into that, I want to get into Coach Conti, because Coach Conti came into play when you were still playing.
Yep.
know, scouting, obviously back then it was different and there was no huddle or anything like that. And you had to rely on scouts. So, the younger guys went and scouted, whatever. So, in your senior year, 86, I went to scout Ocean, or I went to scout Neptune, and I think, and, I did a double scout. They were playing Ocean.
Mhm.
And I saw Ocean do something that like really blew me away. Neptune had a free safety, Stefan Slappy. He was excellent, and Coach Amabile or Coach Mayo, whoever over there, they were sending him an A gap all the time. Okay,
Yeah.
from a safety spot, and it was devastating. I mean, it was crushing. So I go to the game and I see George Conti. Okay, all of a sudden Stefan Slappy steps up like he's coming in A gap. His fullback moves and steps all the way up to A gap, okay, and positions himself in a 2-point stance right at the heels of the center and the guard.
Mhm.
And guess what? The safety didn't go anywhere.
Right.
He couldn't get going. So I bring this back to Coach Comaforo, and I'm like, we got to do this. And Coach Comaforo I love Coach Galaforo, but he's such a competitive guy, and he was, and he was very. I said this before. He's rigid and inflexible in regards to how to do things, and I get it. That was his personality and everything. And he came from He came from college,
Right,
okay, which was different. So he wasn't used to like that. And I go, Keith. He goes, we're not going to do that. He goes, why? Because that's not sound.
right,
That's not sound. I go, Keith. They stopped him. Yeah, well, that's not sound. We're going to stop him and be sound.
right. But let me
Yeah.
let me give you and you know completely separate from that with you when I have a very similar story in it, and I took it with me my entire coaching career on the high school level. I never understood this mentality. So I was defensive coordinator at Long Branch under Freddie Sprengel,
Yep.
and we were playing a huge rivalry against Red Bank Regional.
Yep.
Okay. We had a great running back, Tidy Corbett, and they had Eric McCoo. And I'll never forget our special teams coordinator who played at Penn State.
Yes.
We were at Freddie's house on a Sunday morning going over film and getting our game plan. And I remember I'm sitting there, I'm young, like I'm a young coach, I'm a defense coordinator, and I'm thinking, Eric McCoo was the best running back in arguably the state at that time.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
like, we got, this guy can't touch the ball, and I got to defend him. And I remember we get to the special teams kickoff, and I'm like, we can't kick to this kid. We got to squib the ball away from him. And I'll never forget our special teams coordinator saying, I'm not doing that. That is Bush League. We should be able to run down the field and cover a kickoff. And I remember turning to him like, that's Eric McCoo. I'm like, are you serious right now?
And that's a kicker
And
talking.
yeah, and I was like, wow, this is a different mentality. Like, I don't understand this. Like, you're going to kick this ball in the air to this kid. And, I can't remember what we lost the game, but I don't remember if he was a factor in the return game, but he single-handedly won the game for them.
Right.
But that's that. Yeah, I've dealt with that several times as an assistant coach in my career, where I just look at these guys and I'm like, why would we put this kid? Why would we put our kids at a disadvantage by giving the ball or kicking the ball to their
Correct.
best player? It made no sense.
Right.
Which I know it like irked a lot of fans that we always squibbed the kickoffs, and I think that happened started in Allentown again out of desperation. We're
It
like, we
did.
can't we can't kick to these guys. It
It
didn't
did.
matter who it was. We got to squib the ball. And we just carried that with us, even in our best teams, we squib kickoffs,
Yeah.
you
I love
know?
squib.
Yep.
I love
So, all
squib.
right. So yeah, so I think that's a problem with not a lot of coaches. Some coaches that they can't think outside of their box, and they feel embarrassed when you do things that people may question, but as the coach, your
Yeah.
personnel, your strengths and weaknesses, who you're playing, their strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Why would you ever make it comfortable for
Right.
them?
And you understand, like, what I came to understand as the years went on is that it's not about schemes. It's like, well, we're a 4-4, we're a 5-3, we're a 3-4, we're a 4-2-5. It's about the chess match.
Right.
It's about the chess game that's going on. That's what George Conti taught me by scouting him and playing against him. It's about the chess match.
Right.
So if your kids have the foundation of how to play a defensive football, okay, then you can put those pieces wherever you want,
Mhm.
as long as it works in your mind, okay, like, and you're not vulnerable. Do you know what I mean? So,
Yeah,
like with George Conti again, like you remember, unfortunately you were on the field, but when we played them, they kicked our tail. They beat
I
us
know.
35-0, and we were in shock because they're a much smaller team than us. They had a guard. I forget what his name was, but he was like 160 pounds, and he was jumping over people on the ground to get to whoever he was supposed to block.
Yeah.
And they were driving our defensive ends 10 yards off the field. They're wing backs.
Hmm.
And so that was just a different style of play. And so let's skip forward into the defensive coordinator part, because this is important in regards to the development of my philosophy. The first game in 1988, after John Andel's first game as head coach, and props to Coach Andel for allowing me to develop my creative mind, and using he knew I was an intense dude, and that I meant well and I wanted to win and that the kids liked me, John was really focused obviously on the offense and, you know, we brought in Wagner's. I remember we had Wagner's 4-4 or something like that.
Hmm.
And so we started off with that. And we were going to run a 4-4. Fine. Our first game this is the first time in our history we were playing Bricktown. Okay. And they had an experienced team. And so I go scrimmage them up at Nutley. They're playing Nutley, Brick and Nutley. Brick was huge. It was a heck of a game. And I'm looking at them and I go, we can't beat this team. They're going to kill us in this
Hmm.
40. So I go back to Coach Andel. I'm like, you know what? I sold them on it. I'm like, we got to play a 5-3. So I didn't know much about the 5-3 then. I relied on that book that I showed you, and we had run a 5-3 when you were a senior against Middletown North on the Thanksgiving Day game and
Hmm.
beat them. We surprised them with a 5-3, and that's how I
Hmm.
got into the 5-3.
Hmm.
Well, in any event, we ran the 5-3, but how I did it, okay, and this always pissed me off, okay. I'm gonna get into this right now, okay, like, and this is why I'm different, okay, because the offense has all the advantage, okay, and which you got to deal with if you're on a
Here we
defensive
go.
side of the ball, okay. All right, so they know the play, obviously. All right, yeah, they got to know the play. We get it. They know the snap count, so they let them go on whatever snap they want. Another advantage, two advantages. And this other advantage, when I was a young coach, I'm like, so I'm sitting here and I'm like, every week the offense knows the opposition's defense, what they're going to run on Saturday. They know exactly what to expect. They're going to practice all week long. We got running against a 5-2 or running against a 4-4. There's no surprises. But the defense has to be prepared for some offensive surprises because the offense is like, oh, this is what we're going to change to run against this defense. We're going to show this
Hmm.
formation. We're going to run this play, or we're even going to put this play in. That always bugged me. And I'm like, why should they know exactly what we're playing? And so, this whole thing evolved and started off with this brick game. So with Brick, I did this as a young coach. I'll credit myself. We set them up. They had their game scrimmage first. They came to scout us. I said, we're playing a straight 4-4. We played a straight 4-4 the whole game. We come out against them the following week in a 5-3. They had no idea what was going on.
Right.
And at the time, I was risky as a young man. I sent a lot of backers. As you know, I became much more conservative,
I know.
okay, as I got older. And I don't like sending people, very
Right.
rarely. But back then, freaking, it was the Wild West.
Right.
And I'm sending guys. They got their first down in the third quarter. We ended
Right.
up beating them 14-8. I think they went on to win a Central Jersey Group 4 state champ, or South Jersey
Sectional.
sectional championship. Had a very good team, and that was Stephen Pitt's debut as a sophomore, and he
Yeah.
scored those touchdowns
Yeah.
in 14-8. But anyway, that was the beginning, and that was the beginning of me coming up with these game plans, thinking outside of the box in regards to how to beat these teams. I see, when I look at film or I go to a game and I watch it, start having thoughts. I see these plays and I'm like, this is what we have to do to defend that play. This is what we
Mhm.
have to be in. This is what it all comes together. So it's not like, a compliment I got one time, young guy, I shared a film with him on Huddle because they were going to play somebody or something. And he's like, we're looking, we couldn't figure out what you were doing. And I
Right.
said, it works. I said, you're not supposed to figure out what I'm doing. I said, that's how I coach.
Well, that's the great thing about you as a defense coordinator, and I think why we worked so well together was that our offense was extremely multiple. We were able to morph into whatever we had to do, just like you could on the defensive side of the ball. But our fundamentals and principles and coaching techniques never changed.
Never changed.
Never changed. It didn't matter what defense you were running. The techniques are the techniques by position,
Yep.
and we never changed them. And that's what I try to explain to coaches, like coaches that people I work with in my teaching career, when they're like their minds are like I could see their minds going like what's going on here? What is he talking about? What is he talking about? And I'm just like, listen, the fundamentals never change. Offense with Coach Letson and they never change. Like I can coach his defense fundamentally. I can't do his schemes because he creates those things in his mind week to week, but I know exactly what he's doing. And I took that on the offensive side of the ball, which is why when we talked about game practice plan, I didn't care about defense. Team. Team was my least favorite part
Right,
of running a practice. I cared about individual most, then our group work where it was fundamentals and techniques, no matter what you do.
right.
And so all right. So this brings me to when you started out as so you got the defensive coordinator job solely. It was yours in 88 or 89.
88, there was a transition. So
Okay,
transition
so
88.
at that point, what was your defensive philosophy as a defensive coordinator? Like your overall arching defensive philosophy.
Well, I can, so I'm going to tell you what it morphed into.
Okay.
Okay. So, you're going to ask me as a high school defensive coordinator, and this is my approach. Okay. It's, and this is exactly what I tell my kids is that our goal is to destroy what they do best, not defend it, destroy their A game, destroy what they do best, and we will defend the rest.
Right.
So if they're going to beat us, they're going to beat us with their B game. That's what they're going to beat us with. So if
Mhm.
you got a great running back, our goal, we are going to take that away. Okay. And if you beat us, with something else, hats off. You know what I mean? And one that comes to mind immediately, and you'll remember this game, is in our last season when we played Manalapan, and they had the kid Saeed that went to Penn State. No one could cover him. Okay. So, what we knew Manalapan was great. They had a good team, but this is what I said going in. He's not going to beat us,
Mhm.
and he couldn't. You know what I mean? Like, so what do I do? Do I double him? Well, yes and no. Like I do it differently. What do I do? I put it, I had 2-on-1. So I come out, the corner needed help, man. That kid was great. He was
Right.
fast. He was big, and you just can't put a kid out there. Like I always say as a coach, you have to put a kid in the best position to succeed.
Right.
And how can a 5'7", kid that runs a 5 flat or a 4.9 defend a kid, that's going,
Division
oh yeah,
one.
yeah, he just do it. He just has to be better.
Yeah.
You're being stupid. You know
That's
what I
the
mean?
men
Yeah.
that's the mentality that we have a big, big problem with, which we see all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
So anyway, in that game, I had an outside backer. We beat the piss out of him from the
Mhm.
line of scrimmage. Okay. Could he catch the ball? No. The answer is no. Okay. So I am going to take a Division 1 in high school. I'm going to take a Division 1 receiver away from you. Okay.
You did
Yeah.
that many times, many
Yes,
times.
it's going to be a 2-on-1. I get it, but he's going to be out of the game. So credit to Manalapan. They started running the ball.
Yeah.
Okay. And we had to come off that kid. Okay. And he did hit one big touchdown. But that's the point. That's my goal. And and I tell the kids, and this is very important, like I communicate. And this is one of the things Coach Bova, I think, gave you some questions,
Mhm.
but communication is my game. Anybody that comes and watches me knows that, communication is my thing. I don't just sit there and watch the kids. I'm like manic, before the snap of the ball. First, I want to find out what the formation is and I want to tell them. Okay. I want to make sure they all know it and what the backfield is. I'm yelling it out. Okay. I give them verbal reminders. Okay. As many as I can before the snap of the ball. That's my goal. When I start off coaching the kids, I tell them, I'm like, I want to take my brain. Okay. This is my goal. My brain, and I want to put it in your head. My head is going to go into your head, and then it's going to click. Okay. And now we have them outnumbered. Okay.
Mhm.
I'm on that field with you. It's 12 versus 11. That's what it is. And when I tell the kids this, and I believe that, and they believe it,
Mhm.
and I have this approach, destroy what they do best, defend the rest. And I'm going to tell you, this. Like, I don't know why some guys, they feel like they have to defend,
Everything.
they waste guys in man coverage and things like this. Like, this is high school football. Okay. The quarterbacks are generally average at best. Okay.
Mhm.
At best. Why am I going to defend something? Okay. When I don't need to. Do you know what I mean? So what's your coverage? I am a cover 3 guy. I'm not a cover 2 guy. I hate cover 2. Okay, it's easily exploited. Why am I going to do that? I want a safety in the alley. Okay, because a high school game is a running game. Okay, so I want a safety in the alley. Cover 2, there's nobody in the alley. There's
Right.
nobody in the alley in cover 2. And I want a deep safety for anything that breaks up the middle. High school's a running game. It's a running game. Okay, so I want a good tackler up the middle. I play man coverage, not often, but I do. I don't like playing naked man. What does naked man mean? No safeties. Okay.
Right.
I like playing, too deep zone, 5 underneath man. I'll play that, but generally, I am a cover 3 guy. And here's my philosophy: get me out of it. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, you're giving up curl. Yeah. Complete it again. complete curl 10 times in a row and score a touchdown and you have me sold. Okay.
Right.
Because that's not happening.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that's not happening. And there's different ways that you can take things away. Like, like with our outside linebackers, loose, okay,
Jam,
loose,
dude.
jam, normal, right? There's so many things that you can
All
do.
right, you're getting extremely excited, which is what I love about you. But let's bring this back now so I can follow my script
And
that
get
I
into some
have here.
scheme. I'll tell
Yes.
you. I'll tell you some scheme.
That'll be a little later. I'm still trying to, I want
All right.
people to hear your brain at work from a young coach to what you involved in. So
Sure.
people our age and our kind of generation, um, your defenses at Middletown South were dominant. That 5-3 defense that you created, because you did create it your way. You may have had a blueprint of it, but you turned this into something that at that time no one had any answers for.
Yeah.
Explain your 5-3.
Yeah. So this goes back to high school first. I know that I said that I was a 40, but our defensive coordinator, Lou Givler, he taught actually at Asbury High School. Once in a while, okay, we would go to an odd front, and we would do that by dropping one of the 40 backers down on the nose.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, right, and became a TNT. Okay. We didn't do it often, but we did it once in a while. So I always remembered that. And so, I listen, I'm probably a 40 guy. We can get into this, but I prefer an odd front. Why? I don't want the center snapping the freaking ball.
Right.
Nobody, breathing down his neck. I
Right.
want him concerned. I
Right.
want him concerned that he's going to get freaking smashed. Okay. Every time the ball gets snapped. Okay. And I don't want him getting a free release on the backers. Okay. So, yeah, I like an odd front. But obviously, you're playing a really fast team.
Yeah.
You want to be balanced, and we learned that really much so at Allentown.
Right.
But so I like the odd front. I like the 53. Okay, we got into a situation where I wanted the best of both worlds. When my first two outside linebackers, Chuck Decker and Chris Bova, were excellent outside linebackers, two of the top outside linebackers I ever coached. So I have a lot of great outside linebackers I've coached, man.
Yeah.
I mean, so many of them. I mean, Chris Turner, God bless his soul. Matt Mortis, at Rumson. I was at Rumson for 2 years, and I forget Matt's last name. Matt, I forget his last name, but Matt was a great outside linebacker. Vic Scalisi, unbelievable outside linebacker. Joey Icona was as well. So we had some really great outside linebackers. But I started off my career with these two guys, two all-stars. And so I wanted an odd front, and I wanted two outside linebackers. That's what I wanted. That's
Right.
what I wanted. Is that too much to ask? So, so what I started doing, we had John Little, who was an all-shore linebacker, and Trevor Gallagher was our other inside linebacker. So we
Right.
would start to switch from an even front, okay, to an odd front. And Trevor would go down to nose. And it developed into this thing that I didn't know what was going to happen. It turned into this 7-1.
Yeah.
Okay, that people really weren't used to, other than Toms River South. Toms River South ran a 7-1 type of D. This is another pet peeve I have. In regards to back then, there were guys that were known as defensive coordinators. I don't know if that's the day. Like at
Right.
South, George Bossow was a defense coordinator. At North, Al Turpak. At Neptune, Carl Mayo.
Yeah.
At Ocean, Carmine Magnata. You know what I mean? Like.
Yep.
At Manasquan, I think it was Don Reed. And this meant something to me. Like coaching defense meant something back then. I don't know about today. Anyway, that's a side. But and then the thing that was special about the '89, and I got to say, the '89 defense. Okay, I had a lot of great defenses, but that was the best defense I ever coached, and the reason is the combination of aggressiveness, okay, and speed.
Mhm.
Like that defense taught me that speed kills.
Right.
Okay, people. We were a Group 4 school. My two defensive tackles, Dan Murray and Tim Canavan, I do not believe either of them were 200 pounds. If they were 200 pounds, they were 200 pounds on the nose.
Mhm.
So they were the biggest guys on defense. Once in a while, we had Christian Peter come in and Chris Schutz once in a while, but they weren't starters.
Mhm.
So everyone, this is the only time in my career, everyone on the defense ran under a 5 flat 40. They were
Right.
all 4.8, 4.9 or under, even defensive tackles. So, try being an offense, and run parallel to the line of scrimmage, run a sweep. You know what I mean? I mean, this is where we beat that year. We beat Neptune 41-3.
Right.
Neptune just, they couldn't do anything. The closest game that we had was Bricktown, our first game. It was during a hurricane. I forget which hurricane that was in 1989 in September. Either the beginning of the hurricane, I think. We played the game, and the conditions kind of, did something to how the game was played. But anyway, we beat them 6-2. And I learned a lot there. Coach Wolf taught me a lot too. They actually would have won the game if they didn't clip. I didn't have an answer for double dive. I'll tell the coaches right here.
Yeah.
I was playing the 7-1, and Brick. You're playing Warren Wolf. Here I am, 5, 26, and Warren. They pick up when I'm playing. We were aggressive, and they start running double dives. First time anyone ever ran double dive. So what's double dive? It's 2 dives. So I have one middle linebacker. What happens on the first dive? He's gone.
Yeah.
Okay, so they give it to the second kid. Guess what? There's no one there because I'm playing a 7-1. So I said this on a previous podcast. My thing back then was game planning. Like I was a very good game planner. Okay, but during the game I had more difficult time adjusting.
Mm-hmm.
So I did adjust and it worked. Okay, but as we get older, we understand that this is a very risky thing. So double pinch. So I was pinching the tackles and the ends to stop double dive. And guess what I did? Crushed it. Crushed double dive.
Right.
No more double dive. So what did Coach run? He ran a tight end screen.
Right. No one there.
I was crashing the end. No one there. So anyway, for Brick guys, I know they're not listening to this, but they might say, we should have won that game. That wasn't a clip. Number one, it was a clip.
Okay? Here we go.
Number two, even if it wasn't a clip, okay, if there was Chris Turner, who was the best open field tackler I ever coached, who ended up playing, he's big. He ended up playing outside linebacker the following year because he was so big. He played corner that year. Right. He was an oversized corner, best open. He used to tackle. Michael Pitts used to get so frustrated in practice because Chris Turner would always tackle him.
And Chris Turner was like a silent kid. He never said a word, man. He was something else.
Beast.
So let me ask you a question. So you were in a 7-1, which I'm assuming both your outside backers are somewhere near the line of scrimmage.
Yes.
So that was your original and then you moved it
Correct.
to what you did. All right. So explain that genesis, how you went from the 7-1 to now bringing those 2 outside backers off the line of scrimmage.
Okay. So now I knew that. Listen, I mean, I couldn't have just one backer, but I wanted the best of both worlds. Okay. I wanted a 40 and a 50. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what did I do? I ran a TNT. Okay.
Explain the alignments of those guys.
Yeah. So, the one thing that guys should know is that I changed the numbering system. All right. And guys should be creative. You know what I mean? Like, guys called me unorthodox, whatever. I don't even know.
You made it easy.
Yes. I made it easy. It never made sense to me, fellas, defensive coordinators, where we would go, we're going to start off with a 0 on the center. Okay. Then one shade on the center, then a 2 technique, 3, 4, 5, and now we're off to a 9. Where's 9? You know what I mean? So so my inside shade on the tight end was a 6. My outside shade on tight end was a 7. It wasn't a 9. It was easier for the kids to understand.
Right. And you never used like the 2-eye, 3-eye stuff either.
No.
And I always have this discussion throughout my career with defensive guys. Like, yeah, he's in a 2-eye. I'm like, well, what is a 2-eye? Like, why don't you just number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way out? And that's similar to when I speak of our offense, how we number 1 to 8 left to right. We don't have odds and evens. No. Like most guys have odd. To the left is odd, 1, 3, 5, 7, and to the right is 2, 4, 6, 8. It never made sense to me.
Yeah.
And that was another Coach Camaforo thing. They brought that in.
Yep.
Numbering left to right, how you read 1 to 8.
Yeah. I mean, look, and the thing is simplicity. And also, it's okay, to think outside the box and be a little bit different. Like, look, when I was young and went to these football clinics, these guys were gods. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But
I
then I
agree.
went, but then I went to more. Okay, and one time, Coach Generelli and I were at a clinic, and he'll remember this. And I'm not going to name the coach, but a young coach did a clinic. He was young like us, so he was in his 20s, and he was a famous college football coach's son. So there was nepotism going on. So he wanted to go out to lunch with us because I guess Steven was a senior or whatever. I don't know.
Right.
And so we started talking football. He knew nothing.
Right.
He knew nothing. Now, I had been coordinating defenses for a while, right? So I was seasoned in regards to knowing football. Here's this kid, and I'm like, I couldn't believe what he did not know. And,
Right.
and that started to make me think like, hey, like these are regular guys, yeah. I mean, I respect them. They're doing this for a living. And, but don't be blown away. Okay. And be reluctant maybe to think outside the box. And again, I have to visit, we'll get into George Conti here because George Conti was probably the best high school football coach, you know, um, in regards to influencing me in regards to how high school is a different game.
Right.
It's a different game.
Right.
But so where I put these players to get back to that set, and yes, it was unique. Um, I had we ran a TNT, so coaches know what that is basically, right? A zero on the center and 2-3 techniques with the tackles. Okay, and I had a Mike linebacker right over the center. Okay, and to protect him, okay, from the end, I had my defensive end in a 6 inside shade, and
Of the
then
tight end. Of
of
the
the
tight
tight
end.
end to keep him off the inside backer. And anybody, and you know this, and Coach Generelli knows this because I remember him saying it. Offensive coaches do not like a 6 shade; they hate it.
Right. Right.
Okay, it's a very difficult spot for a defensive end to be in, and it dictates to you where you have to go. Like you have to deal with that somehow. Okay, and then my outside linebacker was right up off the line of scrimmage, like a 2x2. Okay, right off him.
Right.
Now the key to this defense was the other inside linebacker who played half and half. He was a half inside backer. He was a half outside backer. I stacked him over the tackle. So
Yep.
he was stacked over the tackle. And against twins
To the
versus
weak
twins
side. To the weak side. To
to
the
the weak
open
side,
side.
you couldn't get him.
No, I
He was
know.
he was called to strike. You could not get to him. It was impossible. Okay, the kid who had that position loved it because no one could get to him. But
Mhm.
he had to be able, okay, to come up and set the line of scrimmage. Coaches might, well, how'd you set the line of scrimmage? You didn't, if he was stacked. I taught him. He set the line of scrimmage coming up inside out, okay, and set the line of scrimmage with his inside shoulder and forced everything into the mic. Okay,
Mhm.
that's how we did it. And it worked. It worked because the weak side defensive end, our nails end was in a 5. Okay, 5 on the offensive tackle,
Outside shade.
outside shade, and so the strike would come up inside out. Okay, if flow was coming to him and set the corner. Okay, that way. Now against twins, we ideally we would stay in cover 3. We had to change that after a while, and he would move out. The strike would move out. Now, this is what coaches used to do, which is great. They go to twins, and then they'd say, well, they only have one backer now, which is true. And then
Right.
they try to run ISO at the backer. But you know what? It was a difficult thing, because we still had the end in the 6. You
Mhm.
couldn't get to the backer, and the other outside backers would slide in. Okay.
So let me explain this from an offensive perspective, and because I know your defense. So what you're saying right now is when offenses went to twins, that strike, that weak side inside backer in your 5-3
Yes.
would walk out,
Yep.
but you still had an outside shade end on the tackle.
Yep.
You had an outside shade tackle on the guard. You had a head up nose on the center. You had an outside shade on the backside guard, and you
Yep.
had an inside shade on the tight end.
Correct.
Nobody can. And then what you did was that. What did you call your outside? The cat? Who was the outside
Right.
backer?
Well, yeah, it was well, at
It
back then it was the,
changed.
the cat. We changed it to the hit.
The cat, when you got twins, the cat now comes stacked over
Yes.
the tight end, and the
Correct.
Mike backer moves over a little
A
bit to the
little bit.
twins. But what you're forgetting to explain is that your Mike linebacker never got touched,
Untouched.
untouched. So now you
Yes.
have in essence when you're in your base defense, your stack 5-3, which is different than your 7-1, your stack 5-3. You have two backers, your Mike and your strike, which is your will backer, that are untouched. They can't get blocked. They just can't do it. So that from seeing that, that is why if you talk to any guys our age that competed against you, when you were at South, they're like that defense was incredible. Like you couldn't run against this defense.
So what they had, yeah, they they knew what was happening front row, on the front. So, this was a double eagle. So
Mhm.
coaches back then say, well, this is a 50 double eagle, right? Double eagles TNT. But what they gave me credit for was the positioning of the backers.
Right.
They said that you position the backers in such a way that it's difficult to get to them.
Right.
And so so that's where they gave me credit. I very much appreciate it. Now they would make some plays, okay, to try to counter that. Like
Right.
I remember one team ran a middle backer pick, a middle backer ISO. So this brings me into how I coach defense, and this is so important to get across to your guys. Unless there is an open field tackle, a solo tackle, most plays that end up in a tackle, there's two parts to that tackle. Somebody makes the play that allows the tackler to make the tackle.
Right.
So as coaches, a lot of times we focus on the guy who makes the tackle instead of the guy at the point of attack who made the play.
Mhm.
Okay, who did his job the right way so that tackler could tackle him. And I give credit to that guy all the time. I'm like, okay, who made the play?
Yes.
And during film study, I always say that. Okay, all right, great tackle. Who made the play here? And they'll know. So why couldn't they get to the Mike backer? And I'm going to tell you why. Okay, because the Mike backer would make the play. He would fill on ISO. He did his job. So when you fill on ISO, guess what? You can't run there. So the back is going to direct somewhere else. So someone else made the tackle because the Mike filled the ISO. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's so important for coaches to do that. When you're talking to your offensive players, like with defensive tackles, you've heard me say this I tell defensive tackles in the beginning when we first starting, fellas, you got the wrong name.
Right.
Okay. Your name shouldn't be tackle because that's the last thing that you're going to be doing on the field. You have the most important job, but you're never going to make tackles, okay? But you're going to make plays. You're going to make plays so your teammates can make tackles. You have a critical job. So I think that, this is kind of the way over the years that I've morphed into coaching to help kids understand, what's going on, and it's a cohesive thing. Like they're my soldiers, you know what I mean? And
Right.
it's a very cool thing, actually.
So obviously, again, I mean, we can talk. We're going to have to. A lot of this is going to be. We have to do another podcast on your defense. It has to be done. I mean, because there's so many things that you're touching on. So 50. You had your 53. It morphed into the stack 5-3.
Yeah.
Impossible. Had top 5, top 3 defenses for. I would say the entire time you were at the defense coordinator at South, right?
We had great players and
we had great players, which again, we will say this because it's true. We don't have all the answers, but the fact is that if you have the players, that helps.
Yeah.
You have to have the players.
And listen, I don't want to pass it. I got to give Coach Generelli props too, because we were both young at the same time. Like we were a young duo, right?
Go ahead. Think about the staff.
Yep.
I was like freaking 20.
Yep.
You were 25, 6. He was 28.
No, 20, me and him are same age.
Same age. The oldest guy, Coach Moore, Bill Moore, who was awesome. I mean, loved the man. Loved the man to this day. I invite him, he was at everything when I was growing up.
He was the best.
But we had all young coaches.
We did.
Like we had young coaches, but again, we learned from Coach Camaforo and Coach Andel. That's who we learned this all from.
Yeah.
And he was the springboard. Coach Generelli, and we continued it, and it just ran from there.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm going to give props to Coach Andel for, allowing me to partner with him. Such a young guy. Like it's risky. And he, because of him, I was able to, start off with this creative approach that I had that was unique at the time. Because, yeah, I mean, a lot of guys didn't know what I was doing. And then with
Right.
Coach Generelli, we were both at the same spots in our career. He was
Yeah.
developing offensively, and I was developing defensively, and
Right.
we just did our thing. You know what I mean? And it was great. I mean, we were together in '90. We won a state title.
91.
91, we lost Edison in the state title game. 92, we were 11-0.
Yeah.
We won the state. And 93 it was our most difficult year. We were 5-3-1. We started off that year number 1 in the Shore, but we didn't have the team that we thought we did.
Right. Okay. So let's now move on to
Yeah.
the next phase. So you had all that success at Middletown South running your 5-3.
Yep.
Then we go to Allentown,
Yes.
okay, which is a completely different world. So how long did it take you for you to understand or realize that you had to do things differently? We couldn't run that 5-3 at Allentown.
Yeah, it was probably the first game. We started off in the 5-3, and then we played Keyport,
Right.
and we got destroyed.
Yeah.
And the speed difference, obviously Keyport was pretty fast, at least back then,
Mhm.
and we were not. We didn't have
Mhm.
any athletes, and and our kids just weren't football savvy at the
I think
time.
that was it, Tom. I think that was the most of it
Yeah.
because I'm going to touch on how the more time, and this is everywhere you go, specifically on defense, but also I believe on offense where we go, is that the kids go from not understanding the game to completely understanding the
Oh
game,
yeah.
you know? So explain how I remember that day. It was a nightmare. I mean, against Keyport at their place, they were really good. They had two really good running backs in their wing tee. And
His
I
name
could
was
remember.
Malcolm something. Malcolm something.
Yeah, it was the key. Key was one of them. Postel, Malcolm Postel was the other one.
That's right.
Both of those guys on the field at the same time. That was when Keyport was an
And we're
incredible team.
playing Coach Ciccatelli,
I know.
freaking
At
legend,
home, we're
legend.
Allentown, haven't won the game in 5 years, whatever. So we get through that game. We get our butts kicked on every phase of the game.
The youth stunt.
The U stunt. We can talk about that another time. Okay, so what did you do after that? I
Yeah,
know
well,
what you did, but explain to the audience what you did after that.
yeah, I mean, we found out pretty quickly that we had to play a 40,
Hmm.
and be balanced because it was just so easy for teams. We didn't have any speed, and it was easy for teams to take advantage of us.
Hmm.
So we had to, play really disciplined football, be square, and you have to be in position when you're trying to compensate for a lack of speed. You do that with your positioning, okay?
Right.
And this is where your positioning is so critical,
Hmm.
and so just drilling that into the kids and them becoming disciplined. And that, listen, our kids at Allentown wanted to learn. They wanted to play football. They
Right.
wanted to be better. And I will say this, okay, from our first year, from 99 to 2000, that was the biggest difference I saw in one year. How they played defense in regards to their stances, their get off, their tackling. Okay, from one year to the next, that really blew me away.
Right.
But 40, I became a 40 man at that point. And from there, the 40 became extremely multiple, where I could basically do anything. I would play 50, 40, multiple coverages, and I was comfortable doing that. So, thinking outside the box, then, look, I thought outside the box when I was younger at Middletown South. We went to all those state title games, won the state titles and everything, had great players. And but being at Allentown forced me to really think outside the box and be
Right.
creative, okay, to put us in better positions to at least have a shot of being respectable,
Hmm.
of looking like we know what we were doing. And we did, and we did, and we had some really good players at Allentown.
Here's what I think a lot of coaches, like real coaches that played against us, or saw us or were scouting someone else when we were at those Allentown days. Not as much in 1999, but 2000 and beyond. The size disadvantage. Let me just talk about this for a second. You're saying speed, speed, speed. You're right. We lack team speed, but we
Size,
also lack size
yeah,
on our team. So
Yep.
when people came to see us, I mean, let's be realistic. We had like 28, 30 players on a good week. And our starting defensive players probably averaged 140 pounds, 150 pounds. But here's the thing. If you knew what you were looking at, you knew those guys were well coached, they were smart, and they were tough. The toughness, it comes from within, but you brought that all out. And our defenses at Allentown became tough.
Yeah.
Like we may not have won a lot of games, but
They were
people
tough.
knew they were in for a dogfight against our
Yep.
defense
Yep.
when we were at Allentown.
Yep. And this is where, my exposure to George Conti really helped because, George Conti was the first person that I saw, cut offensive linemen.
Yeah, I want to get into that.
Yeah, with smaller defensive tackles.
Hmm.
And he was so effective at it. And it, being, when we played him at South, it caused us so many issues offensively, you
Hmm.
know, and, so it made sense to me talking about the high school game. Like, like why, if my job is to put my kid in the best position to succeed, and this guy, this offensive lineman is 60 pounds heavier than him, stronger than him, is going to drive block him off the ball. Why am I going to allow that to happen? And when I can drop this kid, okay, and make a big pile of humanity, of human mass on the line of scrimmage, where this is where we teach defensive tackles, right? You know what I used to say all the time, and the kids would say it. I'm like, you start here, and they would scream, you end here. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? I go start here, end here, start here, end here. And that's in regards to not getting driven. So, you know, how many guys, how many little kids contributed because they got it? They're
Yeah.
like, I can do this, coach. And at Allentown, like Greg, I know you remember this, and look, this is not sound, but this is what we had to do. We had to cut deep, we had to cut tight ends
I
sometimes.
know. Yeah.
Okay, and I remember maybe it was a consolation game. We had a very undersized defensive end. He was playing linebacker. He wasn't really good at linebacker. I needed a defensive end, and he understood. His name was Joe.
Joe Frank. Joe
Joe Frank.
Frank.
Joe Frank.
Yep.
So Joe Frank did what he was supposed to do. All of a sudden, we come up against this. Joe Frank was not a big kid. I don't know, 5'7", 160. I don't know. So anyway, we come up against this tight end, 6'4", 6'5", driving him off the ball. Now Joe knows we're going to cut the kid, or kids know if I'm getting driven, I'm going to cut him, right? So all of a sudden, Joe's getting driven, and I go, Joe. And he goes like this, and this is all I did. I go,
Right.
oh, and
Right.
he cuts the kid. Now
Hmm.
he cuts the kid. The kid can't get off the line of scrimmage.
Right.
It destroyed what they were trying to do. Someone from the stands could say they're cutting the tight end. That's not sound.
Well, here's funny, and this goes back into coaches being so fixated on how things look and
Yeah,
how they seem unsound. I've had arguments, not hysterical, crazy arguments, with coaches that will never even consider it
I know.
to cut it. That's not football. That's embarrassing. And I just shake my head and I'm like, you guys have no idea what you're talking about, because we did that out of desperation.
Yes,
And even when we had those great defenses at Colts Neck with comparable talent, we still did it.
at times.
It was a fundamental philosophy of our defense.
Yep,
You know?
yep. And I'm going to share a story here, and I don't want to give out names, but you and I were watching a very competitive football game one time against two arch rivals,
Right,
Thanksgiving Day game, and they were both very good,
right.
perennial programs at the Shore. And one of the programs had an excellent defensive tackle.
Mhm.
Okay, he was getting doubled off the ball,
Yeah.
and they were running the ball at him.
I
Okay,
was we were on the sideline for that game.
yes, we knew the defensive coordinator, no names, and we went up. We're like, listen, I'll never forget this ever. He
Yeah.
goes, we're like, dude, you got to cut him.
Hmm.
Cut. He goes, he won't do it.
Yes.
He says I go, he won't do it. Get
Right.
him off.
Right.
He
Yeah.
goes, well, I can't take him off. What? You
I
can't take him
remember.
off. He's not doing what you're telling him to do.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember it.
They would have won
Crazy.
that game. They would have won that game
Yeah.
if they dropped there. They would have won that game. Anyway,
All right. So Allentown, you learned a lot out of desperation, as I did as a young coach, you
and
know.
you know what I learned there too, Greg? I learned how effective a wide out jam is and
Right.
how to coach it.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
it gave teams fits.
Right.
Why do we do it? Because of the speed advantage.
Right.
We had to get out there on those
Desperation.
wideouts.
It was
Desperation.
desperation.
And then we
And
learned how to do it.
and then we just kicked people's asses with that moving on with when we had talent equal, you still did it.
Oh,
And
yes.
that is one of those things where, trust me, there were many times in our career when I was scratching my head like, what is he doing? And then, but I had the because of our relationship and because how much I trusted you and I've seen it work, it was a fleeting thought by that point. It was just a fleeting thought, like, oh my God. But then we carried all these principles over with equal talent and we dominated people with it, you know?
Yeah.
So it wasn't specifically that it was because you had inferior players all the time. It was because it's sound defense to do those things to take away the offense's
Yeah.
advantages.
And this is the difference in the high school game. And I
Right.
would tell young guys, when you go to these clinics, it's great. Learn something from the coaches. It's awesome. But just don't forget that it's a high school game. And, they can't do certain things on their level that you can do in a high school game. And
Right.
don't be scared about how it looks. Like, what did we do to RBC, to their D1, tight end, who
Tight
was
end.
such a great athlete? He was tough as a tight end, and then they would split him out and cause a problem. So when I said, you know what, our defensive end, was athletic enough to go out with them. They saw our defense, and no one could believe it.
My God.
Our defensive end goes out, split, and jams him out there.
It's
And
like,
I taught him in 1 week. Just play the flat, and that stifled them.
dude, just thinking about that. And that was Bill Hincher? No, that was Allentown. It
Mark
was Mark
Kapnick,
Kapnick. And I remember now Mark Kapnick was like 6'2",
6'3". He was tall. He was.
physical specimen. When people saw him get out of his stance when the tight end was out and walk over there, people's minds were blown,
I know.
you know? And the funny, trying to explain that to guys who never saw it, like, I never understood the reasoning why. I can't explain it to them. They
Right.
just don't get it,
So
you know?
so RBC now, okay, by putting him out there, okay, they now they it was a waste having him out there the way we were defending him. He
Right,
didn't catch a ball out there. He couldn't.
right,
Okay. He couldn't be part of the play,
right.
So you might as well bring him back in, okay, where he can be part of the play, So yeah, I mean, and look, that came out of him being a dilemma. He was a great player.
Right.
And their coaches, RBC, using his talents to their advantage by splitting a big guy out there like that and creating an issue. Good
Mhm.
for them. They were able to. So I'm like, man, that is a problem. And so you want to think like, okay, this is a problem, like how are we going to deal with this problem? Like I can't put a small kid out there. What am
Mhm.
I going to do? And so this is the chess match that I love. This is the chess match that I love.
Okay, so let's just take a short time out here, and I
Right.
want to I want to touch on something that became like a calling card for our programs. And this was your baby. You created this at in Allentown, and it was called the Quest. Now, ex-players of ours will understand the Quest because we did it at Allentown, and
Yes.
we also did it at Colts Neck. But this was something that came out. It was purposeful. It was a running event, a long distance running event that
Yes.
was purposeful, but it wasn't for conditioning. Explain what your mentality was with the quest.
Yeah, I mean, so we started the quest off at Allentown, and I came up with the idea. If you remember, when we took over at Allentown, I was 36 or 37 years old, and I was, I've always been a runner. I'm in good shape, whatever, blah blah blah. So, people think this is nuts, but we went back when we could have double sessions. You know, um, you know, I would run, 4 miles on the track in between double sessions, so the kids would see me run. So anyway, we were outmatched as we talked, outmatched physically, on the field. And so thinking that's kind of like, how do we really work the mental advantage? So if
Mhm.
if physically we can't match them, how can we want to be ultra, have an ultra mental edge. And so how do we do that? And so my thinking was, I had run marathons before, and part of the marathon training was developing mental toughness by running around the track over and over and over again. Like I ran 15 miles around the freaking track for the
Mhm.
monotony, okay, to strengthen my mental resolve. And so I thought like this would be great for our kids. Like think about a high schooler. Think about what 5 miles around the track is. Okay, that's 20 laps. If you were in high school and you were thought about doing 20 laps around what would you think?
I'd be miserable.
How am I going to run freaking 20 laps around this
Right.
freaking thing?
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So that was the goal. Now, what our players at Colts Neck don't know, our first quest was 8 miles, and I don't
Right.
know how we picked that number.
Wasn't that through the town though? We did the first quest through the town.
No, that the first quest around the track. Okay, we called the quest. I don't know if
Gotcha.
we did run in the
Through the
town.
town, trying to get the town to, that was we're going to come back to the quest. Okay. This is sick desperation thinking on our part.
What did we do?
Going, like we touched on this on the first episode about how coming into downtown we had changed the entire culture because the
Yes.
town didn't care. They
No.
they football was terrible for so long. They wanted no part of it. So I think I may have come up with this one. I'm like, we're gonna run through the town of Allentown, which is a small, quaint old town.
Yep.
I'm like, and we're gonna advertise this to get people to come out to support their football team. We ran through as a team, coaches as well. We all had to
Yep.
do it.
Yep.
Coaches didn't get to drive their cars or ride a bicycle. Every coach had to run. We ran through the town of Allentown and
Yep.
we had people out supporting us. But this is one of those things that no one would ever do.
No.
And I don't think that did we just make desperation so high? We can't be the only people that felt this desperation to the level we did in programs. But I
No.
think we did. I
Yep.
think we were like, we're not settling for this feeling. We are going to do something about it.
Right.
You know what I mean? And these things started to create and then take on a life of its own about how, you know, desperation becomes inspiration now. Instead of always dealing with desperation, you're going to do inspiration. So that was the first thing. But then the
Yeah.
quest for mental toughness.
The quest for mental toughness, and
That first year we had by
8 miles.
class, those kids had to run like 10 miles, the seniors.
And you remember? No, remember our big lineman? His name was Dan. He was the biggest
Yeah.
kid, and he
Yeah.
ran. He ran the 8 miles. I'll
Dan
never forget.
Gentz. Dan
Yeah,
Gentz.
he ran the 8 miles. We had
Yeah.
a band. Did we have a band that first time?
We had a
A
band, we had
band came
food.
out.
Yeah.
So this became an annual event, and that ended our camp,
Camp.
our August camp,
Yep.
and we had decided it became more structured. The parents ended up loving it. They
Mhm.
used to bring Gatorade, and then it ended up being bagels too. The Colts Neck parents really liked it. So we began to organize it where every year it was graduated. So as seniors would run 5 miles, 20 laps around. Juniors would run 4,
Mhm.
sophomores would run 3, and freshmen then joined as well, and they would
Yep.
have to run 2.
Yeah.
And so, the kids, it was just such a wonderful thing, them supporting each other because running wasn't for everybody, of
Right.
course. The linemen really struggled, most of them, some didn't, but most of them did. And it just became this a very cohesive camaraderie
Right.
type of activity. And then the beauty with that is that you always refer back to it. Like, we freaking completed the quest. Like,
Yeah.
what did these guys do? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
in the heat, in the 90-degree heat, we completed, you guys were running around freaking track, you know what I mean? And dying, you know what I mean? What were these guys doing? So
Right.
yeah, it became really, one of those benchmarks of our
Yeah.
program.
And I believe this is one of the things that separate us from other coaches in our position is that we, even though it's out of desperation, it's done
Yeah.
with purpose.
Yeah.
It's done for a reason.
Yep.
And we just didn't sit there and say, okay, we're just physically outmanned, speed wise, talent wise, size wise, number wise. We get all that. We can't change that.
Yeah.
What can we change? And our teams at Allentown, God bless those kids, man. I've never seen so many undersized football players compete like they were all 220, 6 feet tall. Like there were some times where I would see these guys hits. I'm like, he's not getting up. But they would pop right back up and do it again.
Yeah. And, I'll share this Allentown story because it's a great one. And of course, coaches know, when games get out of hand, they usually let their number one offense and defense, run the first series of the second half, and then they kind of take them out.
Right.
Whatever. So we were playing an opponent, and our kids like to play football. They wanted to play, and so I'm not saying they were disrespecting us, but they didn't let their number ones come out to start the half. They started the half with their JV. So you know, initially I was just like, oh, coaches think, oh, well, they have their JV, we got to get our JV in, right? So we're trying to get a JV team together, and the varsity kids are like, coach, we don't want to come out yet.
Right.
And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, he shouldn't. He put them out too early.
Uh-huh.
I go back in, right? So that the number ones go back in, and of course they're kicking the JV's ass,
Right.
which they shouldn't have been at that school, but we did. And the other coaches are getting pissed at us,
Right.
because we took our ones out. You got to take your ones out. I'm like, well, my kids weren't ready to come out yet.
Right.
It's 35-0 or whatever it is, and they want to play ball. So now they didn't allow us. Okay, they got their number ones back on.
Right.
If you remember,
I got to make a point because I just said that there were a few times in my career from South all the way through Colts Neck and even at St. John Vianney, where I would stand on the sideline and watch a kid make a play and be like, this kid's not getting up. And they would pop up. And I got to tell you, two that always stood out in my mind at Allentown. Ryan Reiser,
can't believe it.
he was 140 pounds, maybe 5'7", would make some hits from his linebacker position that I'm like, this kid is out of his mind.
He had probably one of the fastest closing speeds.
It was
on
unbelievable.
His hits.
Unbelievable.
It was unbelievable.
And a complete nonchalant. We had our different. Him and we had issues that's between the two of us, but in regards to his attitude. But when he was on the field, he was a beast. And then when he graduated, you know who I'm going to say next, Pat Swall, who was even smaller than him. Pat Swall was 5'5", maybe 130 pounds, playing middle linebacker.
Unbelievable football player.
Who would make hits against kids twice his size and never flinch.
Never flinch.
Like it was incredible, absolutely incredible. Yep. But again, you primarily created that toughness. I fostered it within our program to make our whole program believe that way. But the things that you got out of so many undersized people, and that's one of the questions Coach Bove asked, how did you get 120, 130 pound players to play with such ferocity?
I mean, the thing is, I'm a small guy myself, people that know me. And it's not about having little man's complex. I mean, I had that in my life. I don't have it anymore.
Right.
But I just think it's part of who I am in regards to trying to prove yourself and trying not to give any inches. And so, with kids, and coaches should, I am an intense guy. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm intense. That came from an insecurity that drove me towards my goals.
Mm-hmm.
And to get these kids playing, it's just about who I am. Someone says like cursing, you want to say, like, what are you good at? I'll tell you what I'm good at. I'll say, I can get a kid after I get to know them to run through a wall and I don't have to curse once. I don't have to curse one time, and this is how I teach the kids to play. You love this analogy. The kids love this analogy. And I tell them, this is how you play defense. The kids from South remember this because I'm pretty sure I came up with this there. And I just say, I said, all right, You and your family are sleeping in your house. It's quiet. Everyone's asleep. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden you wake up and you hear some noise and you've put it together that someone is breaking in your house. You don't hear anything else. You're probably the only one up. At first, you're really scared, and you don't know what to do, right? But then, okay, that being scared turns to anger that there's someone in your house and they're there to hurt your family, your house. So now you get out of your bed, okay, and you are thinking what you're going to do to this freaking individual who broke into your house, and it is not going to be pretty. You're going to freaking destroy this person. And I'm like, that's how you play defense when
Hmm.
someone broke into your house, and kids love that, and that's how I would play it. That's how I live my life. You know what I mean? So, and I would tell them, from the sideline, I'm like, they're in your house. Someone broke in your house. You know what I mean? And so, that's part of what I said. My goal is putting my brain into your brain. I'm going to put my head into your head, and the kids love it, and I am not a screamer. I am not a screamer. I am not a yeller. Do I talk loud? I absolutely do. Do I lose my cool sometimes? I do, but not at kids. I lose my cool at the unit. I never yell at a kid. I'm loud at a kid in regards to trying to encourage him, but never nothing negative.
Hmm.
But if I ever am negative, okay, it's at the unit that the unit should be doing better. And I expect more out of them or whatever, but I guess it's just part of who I am. You know what I mean? Like, look, I've said this on the other cut, football is at my being. Football is the foundation of my being, and and it's meant so much in my life, and I'm not so sure. Look, yeah, what would have happened if I said, if I didn't follow in the footsteps of these young guys that I named earlier in the podcast that I kind of looked up to, and they were leaders, and I was lucky enough to come along, and learn from them, because then I became my own leader, in my confidence level. Like you and I've talked about this. Like, look, I'm a therapist by trade, counselor, therapist. I think I'm a pretty good counselor and therapist. I really do. I enjoy the work. I make a difference. The best thing I do in this life is coach football. The best thing I do is be a defensive coordinator. I have no interest in being an offensive guy. Okay, none. I've 23 years as a defensive coordinator. I still want to stop the other guy. I want to stop the other guy, and I think it can be done. I always think it can be done.
I can see your eyes, and I know those eyes where they're going. When those eyes get intense like that, we're going to go on forever. I had this entire interview scripted, and you, of course, don't have it scripted. I'm getting stressed out of this because I'm like, I need to get to all these points that I want to make. And because there's so many things going on and you get so intense, I want people to see your
Yeah,
intensity
yeah.
because the way you're talking on this podcast is exactly the way you coach.
Yeah,
Okay.
we didn't get into wristbands. We didn't get into
Right.
loitering. Like I like the loitering.
All right. All right.
I mean,
Time out.
we
Time
got
out.
some
I
good
got to take
stuff.
charge of this. I got to take
All
charge of
right, all
this.
right, all right.
Okay. Because you're going way off out of control right
We
now.
didn't get to Coach Bova's list.
So we're going to end this podcast on this. And what I'm going to say next, because you just mentioned it. I'm not sure if we touched about this on our intro podcast, how we decided to do the podcast. Did we?
How we decided to do it?
Yeah. Where we
In
were
what
going when we made this decision?
what way?
Because you just touched on it again that you have all this football is your being
Oh,
and you have all
yeah,
this knowledge.
yes.
And
It's like
and I don't know if we touched on this on the intro podcast, but that just sparked my memory. So I want to reiterate it to people that may be just
yeah,
joining the podcast.
yeah,
We were both driving down to North Carolina State to visit my son Luke to go watch an NC State football game.
great.
When we left, you were talking my ear off because I can sit in silence and not say a word about anything for the 6 7 hours to get there. You're just going on, going on, and going on, and I'm just listening. All of a sudden, there's a pause, and I don't know if that pause was a minute or an hour. I don't even remember. But you said to me, "I have all this knowledge in my head about football. I need to get this out."
Yeah,
And I sat there in that moment, and I turned to you and I said, "You got to be kidding me. You're saying this right now?" I said, "I've been sitting at home thinking to myself, I have all this knowledge. I need to get it out." That moment, the Here We Go podcast was born.
Yeah, yeah. That goes, if you recall, because my favorite movie is Rocky, and
Yep.
that scene where Mickey's trying to wants to be his manager. He goes, I got all this knowledge.
Yeah.
I want to be a manager. You understand that, don't you? Yeah, I'm
That
like Mickey. I got all this knowledge, and I want to
that's
be.
how this podcast was born. So, Coach, as always, awesome. I can listen to you forever. I mean, I've experienced it all, so
Yeah,
everything you're
thanks.
saying is not new to me, but it's always new when I hear it again.
Yeah, it's fun. It's good stuff.
So we're gonna pause. We're gonna end this podcast on that, and then we're gonna pick up with the second part of this Coach Letson's mind and how it works podcast on next podcast.
And then we'll turn the comments off when I post it. So okay, Coach, that's unsound.
Oh my God, forget it. I mean, I've had so many arguments with coaches about, you listen, here's what I tell people when they ask me about you, would coach consider being my defense coordinator? I'm like, I don't think you can handle him as your defense coordinator. I said, because if you can't just let it go and accept everything that comes along with it, you got no chance with him.
And the other thing is, and I'm going to give you props here, and I think you touched on this in a prior, podcast about, you know, letting me do my thing. Like, part of that is that, I know that on the football field, it's not just the defense that I affect. I am a presence,
Mhm.
I am a presence. And, I love, doing these thought provoking, motivating type of things and what I say to kids, and that to a coach that might could have an issue with that. Like, what are you trying to override me?
Mhm.
Like, you're not the head coach. Like, you know what I mean? And that's not my intention at all. And you
Right.
understood that. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? Like,
Mhm.
you understood that this is just who I am, and that it's for the good of the team, and
Of
that
course.
yeah, it just comes out of my pores.
Of course. All right.
All right, man.
On that note,
You got it.
awesome job today. We can go on forever. We will continue your defensive mind in the next podcast.
Got it, coach. Talk
All
to you.
right, man. Have a great day.